Hi everyone. I am so happy to be here to talk about conversation, corpora, and representativeness. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for putting together such an incredible conference. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank some people who have helped me refine some of the ideas that I'm presenting here today. I'd like to thank Doug, Tony, and Randy for sharing so much of their time and their expertise and their knowledge in discussing these ideas with me. And I'd particularly like to thank Jesse and Tuva, who have pushed me and challenged me in all the best ways. If you know them, you know that they're not only excellent scholars, but they're also excellent people, and I'm very grateful for their mentorship and guidance. So let's get started. As Robbie mentioned, I've been very involved in compiling the Lancaster Northern Arizona Corpus of Spoken American English, or LANA case. This is a corpus that will be 10 million words of spoken conversations shared by participants all across the United States. And right now we have about 8 million words transcribed, and we are, as Robbie mentioned, going to release this in open access in 2026. And this process has been so long and so crazy, as anyone who's compiled a corpus will know. And this feeling of just almost reaching the end. Okay, you recognize this feeling. It feels like, if you've seen The Wizard of Oz, it feels like finally just glimpsing the Emerald City in the distance. We're so close. And actually, I'll make a bold statement. I think that actually a corpus, any corpus, not just LANA case, any corpus that we compile is a lot like the Emerald City. I think that some of the similarities I just mentioned, it's a long journey, long and windy road to get there. In addition to that, and because of that, we often need a team to do it. We can't do it alone. So for example, here is the team that has worked on compiling LANA case. This corpus wouldn't be possible without each and every one of these people, many of whom are sitting in the audience today, actually, so thank you. I'll give you some other examples of iconic teams that have compiled corpora. Here are just a selection of the corpora that are being used and discussed and presented at this conference, along with the team members who compiled them. So we need to work together. The last similarity I'll mention today is, just like in the Emerald City, from the outside, it's hard to tell if we're dealing with the Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz or the Emerald City from Wicked. In order to figure out which Emerald City it is, we have to go inside the Emerald City. We've got to poke around a little bit. We've got to do some evaluating to figure it out. And that's just like a corpus. Even after all of this work and all of this time and all of this effort, we won't know for sure how representative our corpus is until we go inside and we evaluate it. And that's the main message I'll be talking about today, is representativeness, specifically of conversation corpora. As we know, corpora are only valuable insofar as they represent the domain that we actually want to study. And now this idea of representativeness, it's been talked about a lot and in different ways. For this presentation, I'll be using this definition from the Egbert, Biber, and Gray Corpus Design and Representativeness book. And this definition says that representativeness is the extent to which a corpus permits accurate generalizations about the target domain. So if we were to represent that graphically, they thankfully did represent it graphically for us. This is figure 4.1 from the book. You'll see the target domain, what we want to study, and then the corpus is a smaller, albeit representative, hopefully, collection and a reflection of what's happening in the target domain. And they've proposed a framework that we can use when we're compiling a corpus to ensure, as to the best of our ability, that it is representative of the domain that we want to study. And so this includes describing the domain. That's where we identify actually what the domain of languages that we want to study, that we're interested in. Then we can operationalize the domain, where we think about what's feasible for our corpus, plan the sample, we go out and actually collect language samples, and all throughout this process we are evaluating. Now, thinking about this framework, I believe that it can be applied to three major areas, or we have three major considerations when we are building corpora that are representative. First, we want to make sure the corpus is representative of the register, so the culturally recognized domain of language use. What is in our corpus? What texts are in our corpus? And how well do these texts represent register features of the domain that we're interested in? This is the first consideration. And you can see this has been considered a lot in corpus creation. So for example, in the creation of the Brown corpus, we can see that the compilers are talking about ensuring that they have a wide range of styles and varieties of prose in their corpus in order to reflect that domain. Another consideration is the demographics. Who is in our corpus? And how well do these participants represent the participants who engage with this domain outside of the corpus, in the real world? This is a consideration in corpus creation as well. For example, in the creation of the Spoken B&C 2014, which you might be familiar with, the creators were concerned, they were thinking about the representativeness of the demographics in the corpus. And finally, we should think about authenticity. How authentic is the language? And do the language patterns that we can find in the corpus, do those reflect the language patterns that we would see out there in the wild, in the real world, even if that language wasn't collected for the sake of the corpus? And you can see this is a consideration in corpus creation as well. In the creation of the spoken portion of COCA, we can see that Mark Davies is considering how authentic and natural the language is. Now, if we look at all of these together, you might see a pattern. We see that these write to the who and the how of corpus representativeness are often the forefront of our considerations when we're compiling corpora of conversation. We think about demographics and authenticity a lot. And yet this one on the left, in terms of register, how often when we're compiling and using conversation corpora do we think about register in terms of how well the texts in the corpus represent the texts that represent conversation? And how much do we think about intra-register variation, specifically in our conversation corpora? And we know that register has been found to be among the most important predictors of linguistic variation. There's a lot of more research supporting this idea. I chose just 2 citations for the sake of this presentation. So what would it look like if we put register at the forefront of our considerations in compiling conversation corpora, in addition to demographics and authenticity? And that's the idea that we'll be exploring today. We'll be using this framework from Egbert, Biber, and Gray, and we'll be going through each step using Lana case as an example. So I'd like to invite you on a journey with me down the yellow brick road as we explore this question. And we'll be focusing on representing the register of conversation specifically, and again, using Lana case as a case study. So our first step, describe the domain. Jesse, I hope it's okay. I took some creative liberty with this framework. I thought Toto would be a good representation of this step. Because just like Toto, for this step, we have to be really curious about what this domain encompasses. So let's talk about conversation. What is the register of conversation? We know it's probably the most ubiquitous register out there in that everyone uses conversation on a daily basis. And often it's the register we use most on a daily basis. We as in the general public, maybe not linguists. But what exactly does the register of conversation encompass? So you can think to yourself for a second, if you were to describe the register of conversation, what would be the defining characteristics of it? So I had the same question. I conducted a systematic review of 75 studies, corpus linguistic studies that used conversation in the data set. And here's a selection of what came up. We'll go through these one by one. But basically, some of these results they differ from each other, of course, but some of them are actually seem to be contradictory. So if we look at these top three, we can see that conversation is described as spontaneous face-to-face conversation, and yet it's also described as synchronous and written. We see that it can also be referring to language that's recorded in a laboratory. If we go down a little further about the content of conversation, we see that service encounters have been described as conversation. Conversation highlights affective or emotional content, but also it can be about a pre-selected topic. Further down, we can see that conversations might occur with no set activity, where the whole purpose of the interaction is just to sit down and chat. But it can also occur while conducting other everyday activities like making dinner or going shopping. Okay, so what is conversation? This is the question that I addressed in my dissertation. And to answer this question, I drew on both text linguistic register approaches and prototype theory. And there is rich literature supporting the potential collaboration of these two approaches. For the sake of time, I won't go into that today, but we can talk about that later. As a quick review of prototype theory, the classic example is birds, of course. So there are birds that are more birdy than other birds. So crows and sparrows are very birdy, whereas penguins and either an ostrich or an emu is on the outskirts. They're on the periphery. So how about we think about conversation in the same way? We can think about some conversations being more conversation-y than other conversations. Some can be more prototypical and some can be more peripheral. And the reason for this, as prototype theory proposes, would be because of the components of each of these interactions. So we could consider linguistic features that create these interactions, that are the building blocks of these interactions. And we can also consider situational characteristics. So these are contextual features that aren't inherently built into the language, but they take place in the surroundings. They affect the language. These are some things that Gavin yesterday in the plenary talked about as being the mesocontext. So things like channel, is it spoken or written? Things like setting, is it public or private? So we can consider both of these. For the sake of time today, we'll just focus on situational characteristics. And if prototype theory holds true, then we should be able to see situational characteristics that are more prototypical than other situational characteristics, some that are more central or distinctive of conversation than others. And so to get at this data, I conducted a study with 1,300 texts, and each of these texts were annotated for situational characteristics, for 18 situational characteristics. And these texts all had something in common with the situational characteristics that are associated with conversation. But they come from all different places. So these texts came from blogs, from emails, from conversation corpora, but also from written corpora, like academic articles and things like that. All of these texts were inserted into a survey where participants were asked to engage with the interaction in some way. So if the interaction was spoken, they heard it. If the interaction was written, they read it. If it was a video, then they watched it. And then they were asked, to what extent do you agree that this interaction is conversation? And they responded on a Likert scale from 1 being strongly disagree to 7 being strongly agree. And there were about exactly 898 participants for this survey. So that means that each text had a few respondents, at least 2, but often closer to 9 respondents for each of these texts. And by calculating all these numbers, we can see which texts are most conversation-y. And from there, I conducted an analysis using continuous key feature analysis, which for the sake of time, I don't have time to go into, but we will be talking about this tomorrow if you're interested, to develop a rank-ordered list of features of conversation. And these features then range from features, situational characteristics that are most distinctive of conversation, all the way down to situational characteristics that are least distinctive of conversation. So I'll show you the results. Here we go. So on the left, these are all of 18 situational characteristics. And these bars here on the lollipop plot indicate how distinctive they are of conversation. The longer the line is, the more important that situational characteristic is. And we'll be talking about some of these situational characteristics specifically. But overall, all of these situational characteristics, when they're inserted into a multiple regression analysis, the R-squared is 0.59, which means that these situational characteristics alone explain about 59% of the variance in prototypicality scores, which is quite a large number for what we tend to see in applied linguistics. Okay, so let's talk about some of the really important ones. These top four right here, planning, shared context, channel, and setting, just these alone explain about half of that variance, 33% of the variance in prototypicality scores. So these are really heavy hitters in terms of the register of conversation. And these results show that a prototypical conversation includes minimal planning or editing. It takes place in a shared or a synchronous context. It's spoken face-to-face, and it takes place in a private setting. Those are our most distinctive situational characteristics of conversation. Our next situational characteristic here is communicative purpose. And this one is still important, but slightly less important than the ones we just saw. This variable alone explains 9% of the variance in prototypicality scores. And the result shows that prototypical conversation texts have a phatic goal rather than a task-oriented goal. And this is an idea that Malinowski talked about in the 1970s. And it's the idea that basically phatic conversations take place just for the purpose of getting to know someone better, or building rapport, strengthening relationships. Whereas task-oriented conversations happen often for the sake of helping to accomplish something. And I'll show you an example of that right now. So here on the left, we have a phatic interaction. And this interaction turned out to be highly prototypical of conversation. You can see here on the bottom, prototypicality score is 7 out of 7. It's as high as it can go. This is the epitome of conversation, according to the participants. And I will play the audio for you. You can see the transcript. And please listen for the dad joke.
Last week I was 60.
Yeah, good.
I look up to somebody who's 70.
I do too.
Admire somebody.
Well, particularly when they're tall.
So that's our phatic interaction. Here's an example of a task-oriented interaction. And this one we can see is somewhat prototypical of conversation. It was ranked about 4.5 out of 7. I'll play it for you.
So I hit OK?
Yeah, hit OK. So you get one of each kind of card.
Oh, okay. So I get...
So you got 10.
16?
16. Who are you going to trounce on? That's you up there too, right there, you know.
It's me right there, too.
Oh, yeah.
So this is a conversation that's happening between two people who are trying to accomplish something on their computer game. And we can see then that this is not quite as phatic, it's task-oriented, and the prototypicality score reflects that. Of course, the prototypicality score is still somewhat high, 4.5, and that's because this interaction does still exhibit the situational characteristics of conversation that we saw before, the most important ones. So it does take place in a shared context. It is spoken face-to-face. It's unplanned, and it takes place in a private setting. Now that's the general communicative goal. We can zoom in a little bit closer on more specific communicative purposes. And all of these situational characteristics together explain about 0.15 or 15% of the variance in prototypicality scores. So they're pretty important, but not quite as important as the other ones that we've seen. And the results show that in a prototypical conversation, the purpose is often to figure things out, it's to joke around, to comment on our immediate surroundings, to share our feelings and opinions, and the focus is not on giving advice or instructions. Okay, so the results of this study, we can put them all in this nice little plot of conversation with situational characteristics that are most central to those that are most peripheral. And this is a little hard to see, so I spread it out for you as well. We can see these characteristics on the left are most central, so little planning and editing, whereas the most peripheral characteristic then would be an interaction with a lot of planning or editing. Shared context is central to conversation, whereas an unshared context would be highly peripheral, and so on and so forth. We also have some situational characteristics here in the middle that actually didn't make an impact, whether it was included or not, in terms of how conversation-y the conversation was. And here's a selection of those situational characteristics. Okay, so we have described the domain. We got curious and we looked at the features of conversation, the register, the domain that we want to study. Our next step here is to operationalize the domain. So let's think about what exactly is feasible for us to include in our corpus. And I chose the Tin Man for this because this step, I feel, requires you to search your heart and your soul for your priorities. You have to prioritize here. So we have this full, hopefully somewhat comprehensive description of conversation. For the sake of Lana case, which is our case study here, we wanted to focus on prototypical conversation. And specifically, we may want to prioritize here the big heavy hitters, the most distinctive situational characteristics over here on the left. So interactions that have little planning or editing, take place in a shared context, are spoken face-to-face, and are phatic. So we've operationalized the domain. Our next step is to evaluate. And I wonder if you can guess why I chose the cowardly lion here. We need to have some courage to go back and look at both the strengths of what we've done as well as the limitations of what we've done. And this requires some courage. So if we look at our operational domain for Lana case, we can see, okay, the strengths. We're looking at the 4 most distinctive situational characteristics. So that's great. But we can also talk about the limitations here. We have a really rich description of conversation, and unfortunately, in terms of the corpus, what's feasible in this case is to prioritize only 4 of these situational characteristics. And so knowing this, in terms of our corpus, it's helpful for later when we have some results from this corpus. We can be informed a little bit better about how far we can generalize these findings to. Because really what we can generalize them to, we'll find out later with our next evaluation step, but it might just be these 4. But we'll see in a couple minutes. Okay, so we've evaluated. Our next step then is to plan the sample. And I chose Dorothy for this step because everyone has to go out and actually do something and collect the data, make things happen. Just like Dorothy. Okay. Thank you for the laugh. Okay, so planning the sample. In the instance of Lana case, we did try quite a lot of things in terms of recruiting and sampling conversations from a wide variety of people. For the sake of this presentation today, I'll focus on just 3 different examples of recruitment methods. The first one I'll focus on, Robbie introduced so wonderfully, is recruitment through TikTok. And I've included a couple screenshots here in an effort to both acknowledge and also maybe embarrass everyone who's been on the TikTok. But really, please don't be embarrassed, actually, because you've helped a lot, both with recruiting for the corpus, but also gathering general interest about our field, I think. So by posting recruitment videos and other linguistics videos on TikTok, we have been able to receive 460 hours of conversation from participants who found out about this project from TikTok. The total corpus has 1,000 hours of conversation. So this is about half of our corpus came from TikTok specifically. Another recruitment method we used was course extra credit. And this might be a familiar recruitment strategy to some of you, where we offered students extra credit when they submitted their conversation recordings. And of course, there were other plans in place to make sure that the extra credit was ethical, that they weren't feeling coerced to submit conversation recordings, of course. Our total recruitment for this was 284 hours. So we received 284 hours, about a third of our corpus, or a fourth of our corpus, from recruitment through class extra credit. And the last one that I will talk about today is recruitment through assisted living centers. We traveled to assisted living centers all across the United States and hosted conversation activities with the residents there. And basically through these activities, the residents had interactions, had conversations with each other, as well as with other volunteers who came to the activities that we could use in the corpus. And we collected about 30 hours of data from this recruitment strategy for the corpus. So as you can see, it's not quite as fruitful in terms of the number of hours that we received here, just because this was an extremely sort of hands-on recruitment activity. But we do hope that this information we've received is valuable here, the data. Okay, we've sampled our data, and now, again, the cowardly lion returns, because now we're evaluating the data that we've actually received. In terms of this step of evaluation, previous research that has used this framework has relied on qualitative and somewhat observational data to evaluate, to draw conclusions about how well we've done in terms of the sampling. And that's great. Qualitative information is extremely important, but it doesn't give us the entire picture. And so, particularly, it doesn't give us the picture of to what extent does our sample differ from our operational domain. We can't really scale our results when we're using only qualitative data. And so I will propose in the next couple slides a method we can use to quantitatively evaluate how close our sample is to our operational domain. In order to do this, we can randomly select texts in the corpus. For the case study here, I selected 5% of texts from LANAcase, which is 75 texts because we have about 1,500 texts in the whole corpus. And then I manually coded the situational characteristics that are most distinctive of conversation. Those are the situational characteristics we just talked about earlier that emerged as being very important to this register. Because some of these codes were on different scales, I rescaled them using proportions so that in the end, the maximum values for each situational characteristic represents the most prototypical text. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So these are all the situational characteristics that emerged from the data set earlier, and these are the ones that turn out to be most distinctive. And so in conducting this analysis, you'll see these same situational characteristics are placed around a radar plot here. And you'll see right now this yellow line tracing the plot it represents the most prototypical conversation. So I'll show you the evaluation of our sample of LANAcase, and you'll see that the closer the data point gets to the situational characteristic, the more prototypical it is according to that particular situational characteristic. Okay, I'll show you the results here. So we can see the green is overlaid now on top of the sort of perfect prototypical text. And the green represents the prototypicality of Lana case. We can see it's doing really well in terms of planning, shared context, channel, and setting. And these are the ones that are actually most important to conversation that we mentioned before. We can see when it gets to communicative goal, there tend to be maybe some interactions, some conversations in this corpus that are slightly more task-oriented. And then when we get to the more specific communicative purposes, we can see that these differ even more from our sort of classic prototypical text. And these results actually, of course, they kind of disappointed me, but they surprised me a little bit because I was expecting to see much more prototypical results for these two features. But when you think about it, how often do we have the full conversation where the whole purpose is just to joke around, where we're just sitting down and telling jokes back and forth? It doesn't happen very often to me. And maybe same thing with figuring things out. And actually, we do have some evidence from previous literature, including an example just from yesterday. Zhao and McHenry talked about communicative purposes in conversation, and there's preliminary evidence there to show that maybe these situational characteristics aren't actually that frequent in conversation, even though they are distinctive of it. So that's the evaluation of the whole data set. We can actually look back and evaluate the data set based on each recruitment method to see how effective each was. So let's do that for our TikTok recruitment. Again, this is about 46% of our corpus. And I'll show you here now the yellow-green. This is the full corpus sample. And then on the fringes, you'll see the blue. And this is the sample from TikTok. And you'll see that our sample that we received from TikTok does do a little bit better in terms of joking around and figuring things out. So I'll show you an example here. This is sort of a classic, highly prototypical text that was received from our TikTok recruitment.
It wasn't your food, I promise.
I would hope not, since you took one bite.
I know it doesn't look good, but I promise it wasn't your food.
I mean, the food's, like, pretty bland and not the best food in the world, but, like, it's not that bad.
No, it's good, I promise. The chicken was actually good, I promise.
I know it's good. It's my favorite.
I'm just like, it was actually good. My stomach hurts so fucking bad right now.
You poor little baby.
So you can see this conversation includes all of the features we looked at, including joking around and figuring things out. In terms of recruitment through our course extra credit method, again, this was 28% of the corpus. Here are our results. We can see the blue overlay on the radar plot is the results from this method. We can see it looks extremely similar to the full data set. One thing are these communicative purposes are slightly different. And looking at the data, actually, it became clear that many of these students who submitted data were recording conversations that they had with a parent. And it turns out that when you have a conversation with a parent and you're an 18-year-old, there might be a lot of advice being exchanged, sometimes unsolicited advice. I will play you an example of that.
Well, last night, I barely got any sleep. I got about 5 hours because my roommate was on FaceTime until 2:30 again.
Did what?
She was on FaceTime until 2:30.
Well, I'll tell you, when you have a meeting like this, you shouldn't have a bright light behind you. You should turn around, put the bright light in front of you. There you go.
Sorry, I'm in like the lounge right now.
And did you tell her, hey, could you take that outside?
Next time
You guys have a place down the hallway or something, like a community room?
So that's one example of advice being shared in these interactions. And the last one is recruitment through assisted living centers. Again, this is a smaller data set. It's about 3% of the corpus. So we can expect that the results are going to look a little bit more different from the full corpus sample. This is what they look like. Again, you'll see the blue data is the data that we received from this recruitment method. And notably here for setting, it's somewhat less, highly less prototypical actually, and that's because all of these interactions were recorded in a somewhat public location at an assisted living center, event center. And so people were walking by, joining in conversations and then leaving, and this is, according to the previous results, somewhat less prototypical of conversation. And you'll also see some differences in the communicative purposes. One thing notable that I noticed was that the purpose that is shared most often in assisted living centers is actually describing or explaining the past. And that's a result that's not even on this radar plot because that situational characteristic didn't emerge as one of the most distinctive ones of conversation. But I will play an example for you of that.
I have an aunt, had an aunt and uncle. We come down here to do their Christmas shop.
A lot of people come out of town to come here.
Shop.
Yeah, no tax.
No tax. I can buy here the same thing. When I went to California to shop, they had the same thing here in this store as they had in the store over there.
Really?
So I asked the girl, I said, can I buy my the suit here that I want? She says, can you hold on? I said, I'm going to charge it. She says, but I have to check to see if I can put it on your charge because we have a tax here and you don't have a tax in Delaware.
Okay, so you can see she's really talking about the past, and this is a pattern that emerged quite often in the assisted living center interactions. Okay, so we've evaluated over our sampling methods as well, which means dun, 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 we've made it to the end. We've made it to the Emerald City at long last. So I hope throughout this whole process there are a couple things we can take away from this presentation beyond this process of corpus design, which again is hopefully something we can take away as well. In terms of the nature of conversation, we've seen here that conversation is extremely heterogeneous and broad, much more so than I had previously thought for sure. And we can also see that some situational characteristics are more distinctive of conversation than others. And actually, this result, and in terms of pulling in prototype theory to help describe and understand the register of conversation, it helps us consolidate some of these results that we saw earlier, that they looked contradictory, but in fact, none of these descriptions, according to the data from the study, are actually wrong. It just seems that these linguists are describing interactions that may be more or less prototypical of conversation. And I hope in terms of evaluating corpora, particularly conversation corpora, we can see that corpora can be quantitatively evaluated according to not just the representativeness of demographics, for example, but also according to their register. And that the choice of our sampling methods really has a big impact on what our final corpus looks like in terms of the representativeness of its register. In applying this information, I believe, as it's been presented here, that it can be useful for selecting and designing appropriate corpora, especially conversation corpora. But I hope the implications can be a little broader as well. Hopefully we can use maybe more precise language to discuss the conversation data that we're dealing with. And this is an idea that Larson and Biber discuss, where if we're using clear, specific, and precise language, that will help us as a field build on each other's work and create a cumulative body of knowledge regarding conversation. And I hope that we can also evaluate the register representativeness of other conversation corpora, not at all in an effort to maybe point out any potential limitations, but instead so that we can understand exactly what the data we're dealing with represent, because that will help us determine which research questions we can most effectively answer with the data. Because whether we're dealing with conversation corpora or corpora from other registers, in order to be able to draw generalizations about that data, we really do need to know what's going on behind the curtain. Thank you.